They refused her a seat on the train, but what happened next made the whole station fall silent. Because dignity, out here, doesn't shout, it waits. The noon sun hung high over the small wooden platform, heat shimmering above iron tracks that stretched for miles like a promise no one intended to keep for her. And Lena Ayasha stood just off the last step of the passenger car, one hand still half raised, as if the moment hadn't finished yet, as if someone might still change their mind, but no one did. The conductor avoided her eyes, brushing dust from his sleeve that wasn't there, while a woman in a pale dress pulled her child closer, whispering something that sounded like warning, like distance, like the kind of fear people pass down without ever questioning. The torn edge of her ticket fluttered once in the dry wind before falling still against her fingers, and she didn't look down at it, not yet, because sometimes looking makes things real in a way the heart isn't ready to carry. Around her, boots shifted, low voices murmured, a quiet circle forming without anyone admitting they had stepped closer, drawn by something they couldn't name, maybe curiosity, maybe judgment, maybe the need to see how a moment like this ends. Lena's dress, simple and worn, caught the sunlight in dull threads, and dust clung to the hem where the road had followed her for miles. Miles that had led her here with nothing but a bag of folded cloth and a direction she hadn't questioned until now. She inhaled slowly, the air tasting like iron and heat, and for a second her shoulders tightened, just a fraction, like something inside her had finally reached its edge, but it didn't break, it held, the way old wood holds through storms no one remembers. Somewhere behind the crowd, a horse shifted, leather creaked, and a man stood with one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, not moving, not speaking, just watching the scene unfold with a stillness that didn't belong to the noise around him. Ethan Cole had seen towns like this, moments like this, the quiet ways people decided who belonged and who didn't, and he had learned that the loudest thing in a place like this was never the shouting, it was the silence after a line had been drawn. Lena finally lowered her hand, the motion slow, deliberate, like setting something down that had weight beyond what anyone else could see, and she stepped back from the train, boots touching gravel with a soft crunch that echoed louder than it should have, and for a heartbeat no one spoke, not even the wind. The conductor cleared his throat, said something about rules, about order, words that sounded practiced, safe, but they drifted past her like dust, never landing, because she had heard them before in other forms, in other places, always meaning the same thing. She turned slightly, not toward the town, not toward the road, but toward the tracks stretching west, eyes narrowing just enough to hold back something deeper, something older, and under her breath, barely louder than the whisper of wind through dry grass, she spoke in a language no one there understood, a few words, soft, steady, like a goodbye she had rehearsed long before this day ever came. The crowd shifted again, someone chuckled uncertainly, someone else muttered, and that was when a hand reached out, not gentle, not cruel, just careless, brushing her shoulder as if to move her along, as if she were part of the dust that needed clearing. She didn't stumble, didn't react, just stilled even more, like stone, and that was when Ethan moved. Not fast, not loud, just a step forward that cut through the space between them like a line no one else had the courage to draw, boots settling into the gravel with quiet certainty. He didn't look at the man who had touched her, didn't look at the conductor, didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her, really looked, as if the dust and the silence and the torn ticket were just the surface of something worth seeing. For a moment, nothing happened, and in that moment, the station held its breath without knowing why. Then he spoke, voice low, steady, carrying just far enough to reach the edges of the crowd and no further. My twins need a mother like you. The words didn't rise, didn't demand attention, but they landed heavy, like something placed carefully on a table where everyone could see it and no one could ignore it. A few people laughed, short, unsure, the kind of laughter that tries to restore a balance that's already gone, but it faded quickly because Ethan didn't smile, didn't shift, didn't take the words back. Lena blinked once, slow, as if the meaning had to travel a longer road to reach her, and when it didn't show in surprise, not exactly, more like recognition brushing against something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. Behind Ethan, two small figures appeared at the edge of the platform, dust on their boots, eyes fixed on the woman standing alone by the tracks, And before anyone could question it, before anyone could stop it, they ran straight toward her, calling out a word that didn't belong to this town, didn't belong to this crowd, but belonged to her. And the moment they reached her, everything shifted, quiet as a breath, final as a truth no one there was ready to face. The boys did not slow down until they reached her, their small hands grabbing at the fabric of her dress like they had done it 100 times before, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Lena's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat because she knew those eyes. She knew that look of quiet knowing, the kind that does not belong to children who have lived easy lives. And one of them spoke again, softer now, the same word, the same sound that had echoed in her memory through nights she thought she had left behind. And the world around them shifted in a way the crowd could feel but not understand, like the air itself had changed direction. Ethan did not move closer, did not interrupt. He simply stood there with that same stillness, watching as recognition unfolded in silence, because he had seen it before in other forms, the way truth reveals itself without needing permission, and he knew better than to rush something that had taken years to return. Lena slowly lowered herself to one knee, not out of weakness but to meet them where they stood, her hands hovering for a moment before gently resting on their shoulders, as if confirming they were real, as if grounding herself in something she had once believed was lost to time. And her voice came out, quieter than the wind, shaped by a language that carried more memory than sound, and the boys answered without hesitation, their words flowing easily, naturally, like a bridge no one else could cross. The crowd shifted again, confusion replacing judgment, whispers turning uncertain, because whatever they thought they had seen before no longer fit the shape of what was happening now. And the conductor, still standing near the train steps, glanced back over his shoulder as if the iron machine behind him might offer some kind of answer, but it only waited, silent, indifferent to human misunderstandings. One of the boys reached into his small pocket and pulled out something worn, something small enough to be overlooked by anyone who did not know what to look for, and he placed it gently into Lena's hand, and when her fingers closed around it, her eyes flickered for the first time, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with something deeper, something that carried both weight and warmth at once. It was a simple piece of braided leather, faded by sun and time, but she remembered the moment it had been tied, remembered the cold night, the quiet fire, the promise that had not needed words, and for a second the station disappeared, replaced by a memory that lived somewhere far beyond these tracks. Ethan watched that moment carefully, because he had never asked his boys to explain what had happened years ago, never forced their stories into shapes that made sense to him. He had only listened when they spoke, and waited when they did not, trusting that some things were meant to return on their own. The taller boy looked up at Lena then, his expression steady in a way that mirrored his father, and he said something in English this time, clear enough for the crowd to hear, but meant only for her. "You told us not to be afraid." The words settled over the platform like dust after a long ride, quiet, undeniable, and Lena's hand tightened slightly around the leather as if holding on to that moment, as if anchoring herself between who she had been and who she was now. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, her shoulders softened, just enough to show that. The weight she carried was shifting, not gone, but no longer hers alone. Ethan took one step forward then, slow, deliberate, stopping just short of the space that belonged to them, his voice low when he spoke again, not for the crowd, not for the conductor, but for her. They have not spoken that way to anyone else. There was no pride in his tone, no claim, just a quiet truth laid out between them, and Lena lifted her gaze to meet his, really meet it this time. And in that look there was a question, not spoken, not formed into words, but clear enough for a man who had learned to listen beyond language. Around them, the town held its distance, no longer pushing, no longer laughing, just watching as something they did not understand took shape in front of them, something that did not ask for their approval. The train whistle sounded in the distance, long and low, a reminder that time does not wait for anyone, that choices move forward whether a person is ready or not, and the conductor shifted his weight again, glancing at his watch, at the tracks, at the woman who was no longer standing alone. Lena rose slowly, the boys still close to her sides, their presence steady, grounding, and she looked once more at the train, at the open door, at the path she had thought she needed to take, and then back at Ethan, at the quiet certainty in his stance, at the life that stood behind him in two small figures who had already chosen her without asking. She did not speak, not yet, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with something that had traveled a long way to arrive exactly here. And for the first time that day, the road ahead did not look like something she had to run toward. It looked like something she could choose. The whistle stretched across the sky like a warning that did not care who heard it, and the train began to move, slow at first, wheels grinding against iron as if the earth itself resisted letting it go, and no one stepped forward to stop it. No one called out, because whatever decision had needed to be made had already passed through that quiet space between them. Lena watched it for a moment. Longer, just long enough to feel the weight of what she was not choosing, the miles she would not travel, the life she had almost disappeared into. And then she let her gaze fall away from the moving cars and settle instead on the boys beside her, their hands still lightly holding onto her sleeves, not tight, not afraid, just certain she would not vanish this time. The smaller one shifted closer, pressing against her side in a way that spoke of memory more than comfort, and she did not pull away, did not question it, because some connections do not need to be explained, they only need to be recognized when they return. Around them, the platform had grown quieter, the kind of quiet that follows when people realize they have witnessed something they cannot easily fit into their understanding, and the same woman in the pale dress who had stepped back earlier now stood still, her grip on her child loosened, her expression no longer sharp, but uncertain, as if she had seen something that did not match what she had been taught to believe. The conductor finally turned away from the departing train, his role finished, his authority no longer needed. And for a moment he looked at Lena, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter of rules, and then he lowered his eyes, not in shame, but in quiet acknowledgement that he had been part of something he did not fully understand. Ethan remained where he was, patient, steady, giving the moment room to settle, because he knew better than to rush what had already begun to change on its own. The taller boy stepped slightly forward then, turning just enough to face his father, his voice carrying a calm certainty that did not ask permission. "She is the one." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that did not need explanation, and Ethan gave a small nod, not surprised, not questioning, just accepting what had already been decided in ways deeper than words. Lena heard it, understood enough to feel its meaning, and she looked between them, father and sons, seeing not strangers, but something forming, something that felt both unfamiliar and strangely known, like a path she had once walked in. Another life. A breeze moved through the station then, lifting dust and loose strands of hair, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and for a brief moment the world felt larger than the narrow judgment of a small town, wider than the lines people drew to separate themselves from what they did not understand. Ethan finally stepped closer, closing the last few feet with the same quiet confidence he had carried from the start, stopping at a respectful distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to leave her space untouched. "There is a ranch about 8 miles north of here," he said, his tone even, grounded. "Not much by most standards, but it is ours, and there is room for someone who knows how to stay when others walk away." He did not say more than that, did not offer promises he could not guarantee, did not dress the truth in anything softer than what it was, and Lena listened, not just to the words, but to the way he said them, to the steadiness that did not try to convince, only to offer. The boys looked up at her again, waiting without pressing, their trust already placed in her hands without condition, and that trust settled heavier than any doubt she had carried to this place. She glanced once more toward the road that led away from the station, the long stretch of dust and distance that had been her only companion for so long, and then back at the tracks where the train had already become a fading line against the horizon, and something inside her shifted, quiet but certain, like a door closing behind her without regret. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of a choice made without haste. 8 miles is not far. It was not a yes, not fully, but it was not a refusal either, and Ethan understood the space between those words, the room it held for something to grow, something to be proven rather than promised. He gave a slight nod, turning just enough to signal his horse, the animal stepping forward with a low, patient sound, as if it too understood that this moment required no rush. The boys stayed close to Lena, one on each side, their presence no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but settled, as if they had found something they had been looking for without knowing how to name it. And as the small group began to move away from the station, leaving behind the platform, the whispers, the narrow lines that had tried to define her, no one stepped in their way, no one called them back, because sometimes the quietest departures are the ones that change everything, not with noise, but with the simple, undeniable act of choosing where you belong. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of dust and heat, the kind that swallowed footsteps and erased where you had been, and Lena walked it in silence, the boys close at her sides, their small boots kicking up soft clouds that drifted behind them like fading memories, while Ethan followed just a few paces back, leading the horse with a loose grip on the reins, not guiding, not rushing, just keeping pace with something that had found its own direction. The town fell away slowly, its wooden edges shrinking into the distance, voices dissolving into the open land where judgment did not carry as far, and the only sounds left were the rhythm of footsteps, the soft creak of leather, and the wind moving through dry grass that bent but never broke. Lena kept her gaze forward, but her senses remained sharp, aware of every movement, every shift in space around her, because a life spent moving alone teaches a person to listen to what is not said. And yet there was something different now, something quieter, something that did not press against her the way the world usually did. One of the boys, Noah, glanced up at her more than once, as if making sure she was still there, and each time their eyes met, he gave a small nod, like a promise he did not know how to put into words, and Caleb walked on her other side, his steps steady, his attention moving between her and the land ahead, already measuring distances, already learning the shape of what might become home. After a while, the station was no longer visible, just a memory behind a rise of low hills, and the path narrowed into something less defined, more honest, a trail shaped by use rather than design, and Ethan stepped forward then, not to lead, but to walk beside them, his presence settling into the rhythm without breaking it. "Water is about a mile ahead," he said, his voice calm, practical, as if speaking into the space rather than at her, and Lena gave a slight nod, acknowledging without needing more, because she could feel it too, the faint shift in the air, the promise of something cooler carried on the wind. They walked in silence again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was not empty. It held something shared, something that did not need filling, and when they reached the small creek, the boys moved ahead, kneeling at the edge to cup water in their hands, laughing softly when it slipped through their fingers, their voices lighter now, freer, like something inside them had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Lena paused a few steps back, watching them, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not know what to look for, and Ethan stopped beside her, resting one hand lightly on the saddle, giving her the space to choose whether to step forward or remain where she was. "They were not always like this," he said after a moment, his tone low, steady, quiet, careful, like they were listening for something that never came. Lena glanced at him then, just briefly, and in that look there was a question, not about the boys, but about the space between then and now, and Ethan understood enough to answer without being asked. "It changed about a year ago," he continued, his gaze on the water, not on her. "After they came back from a trip with the trader near the southern ridge, they spoke of a woman who helped them when they got lost, said she stayed with them through the night, kept them calm, taught them words I did not know, and when I asked where she went, they said she did not stay for thanks." Lena's fingers tightened slightly around the leather braid still in her hand, the worn edges pressing into her palm like a memory that refused to fade, and she looked toward the boys again, seeing not just who they were now, but who they had been in that moment, smaller, uncertain, standing at the edge of something they did not understand, and something inside her shifted. Again, quieter this time, deeper. "You trusted that?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a trace of something old, something that had learned not to expect belief, and Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. "I trust what does not need to be proven," he said, simple, direct, and the words settled between them like a stone placed carefully where it would not be moved. The boys looked up then, noticing the stillness, and Noah stood, walking back toward them with water dripping from his hands, his expression open, unguarded. "You are coming with us, right?" he asked, not demanding, not pleading, just asking as if the answer already existed and he was simply waiting to hear it spoken. Lena did not answer right away, her gaze moving from the boy to the land beyond the creek, to the hills that rose gently in the distance, to the sky that stretched wide without boundaries, and for a moment it felt like standing between two lives, one that had been shaped by movement and distance, and one that stood quietly ahead, offering something she had never allowed herself to hold. She stepped forward then, slow, deliberate, kneeling at the water's edge beside them, dipping her hand into the cool current, letting it run over her fingers, grounding herself in something real, something present, and when she lifted her hand again, letting the droplets fall back into the creek, she spoke, not to the boy alone, not to Ethan, but to the moment itself. "I will walk the 8 miles, she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough weight to be heard, and the boys smiled, not in surprise, but in quiet certainty, as if they had known all along that this path would lead here, and Ethan gave a single nod, not in victory, but in acknowledgement, because out here, a decision like that was not something to celebrate loudly, it was something to respect in silence, the kind that carries further than any words. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time they left the creek behind, shadows stretching longer across the land like quiet reminders that every step forward carries the weight of time, and Lena walked with a steadier rhythm now, her pace. No longer measured by escape, but by something closer to intention, the boys still flanking her like they had claimed their place without needing permission, while Ethan moved just behind them again, allowing the space ahead to belong to her choice rather than his direction. The land changed gradually as they moved north, the dry grasses giving way to patches of low green, stubborn life clinging to the edges of a place most would call empty, and in the distance, the outline of a fence began to take shape, uneven in places, weathered by years of sun and wind, but still standing, still marking something that had been held on to despite everything that tried to wear it down. Noah pointed first, his voice carrying a quiet excitement that did not break the calm but added to it. "That is ours," he said, not with pride, but with a simple certainty that made the words feel heavier than they sounded, and Lena followed his gesture, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the shape of it. The way the fence did not enclose so much as suggest a boundary, a place where someone had decided to stay. They reached it just as the light softened, the sky turning from harsh blue to something warmer, something that made the land look less like a test and more like a promise, and Caleb moved ahead to unlatch the simple wooden gate, the hinge creaking in a familiar way that spoke of use rather than neglect. Lena paused there for a moment, her hand hovering just above the top rail, not touching it yet, because crossing into a place like this was not the same as walking down a road. It carried meaning, it asked something in return, and she had learned to feel those moments before stepping through them. Ethan stopped beside her then, close enough that she could sense his presence without needing to look, and he spoke quietly. "It does not belong to me the way towns think of ownership," he said, his gaze on the land beyond the fence. "It belongs to the work we put into it, and the people who choose to stay." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something that did not try to convince, only to offer a truth that could be accepted or left behind, and Lena let her hand settle onto the wood at last, the surface rough beneath her fingers, real, grounded, and after a brief pause, she stepped through. The boys followed without hesitation, as if this moment had always been waiting for them, and Ethan came last, closing the gate behind them with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something without needing to name it. The path from the gate to the house was narrow, worn by repeated steps, and as they walked it, the ranch revealed itself piece by piece. A small barn off to the left with a roof that had been repaired more than once, a line of posts where tools hung in careful order, a stretch of open ground where the earth had been turned and turned again, refusing to give up its yield without effort. The house itself came into view slowly, a modest structure of wood and stone, nothing grand, nothing meant to impress, but solid in a way that spoke of persistence, of someone who had built it not to be seen, but to last. Lena slowed as they approached, her eyes taking in every detail. The way the porch leaned just slightly, the way a single chair sat near the door as if it had been left there at the end of a long day and never moved since, and something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition, because she knew places like this, places that held stories in their silence. Noah ran ahead, pushing open the door without knocking, his voice calling out as if expecting an answer, though none came, and Caleb followed more slowly, turning once to look back at Lena, waiting in a way that made it clear this step mattered. She reached the base of the porch and stopped, her gaze lifting to the doorway, to the shadowed interior beyond, and for a moment she did not move, because standing there felt like standing at the edge of something she had never allowed herself to imagine, something that asked not just for her presence, but for her willingness to stay. Ethan remained a step behind her, not urging, not speaking, because he understood that this was not his moment to shape, it was hers to decide, and the quiet between them held that understanding like something shared without needing to be said. The wind moved. Again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of wood and earth and something else, something that felt like time held gently rather than chased, and Lena exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried for miles easing just enough to let something new take its place. She stepped onto the porch then, the wood creaking beneath her weight in a way that sounded less like warning and more like welcome. And as she reached the doorway, she paused once more, her hand resting lightly against the frame, grounding herself in the present before crossing fully into it. Inside, the space was simple, clean, marked by use rather than decoration, and the light from the open door stretched across the floor in a long, quiet line, dividing what had been from what might be. Lena stepped across it without looking back. The air inside the house held a quiet stillness, not empty but settled, like a place that had learned to breathe slowly over time, and Lena stood just past the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the softer light, tracing the edges of a life that had been lived without spectacle, without noise, but with a kind of steady intention she recognized even before she could name it. The wooden floor beneath her boots carried faint marks of years of movement, small scratches, worn paths that led from door to table, from table to hearth, each one a quiet record of days that had followed one another without interruption, and the scent of dry wood and faint smoke lingered in the air, not fresh, not stale, just present, like something that had always been there. Noah moved ahead quickly, as if eager to show what already belonged to him, pointing toward a small table near the window. "That is where we eat," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride that did not need decoration, and Caleb stepped past him, opening a cabinet with careful hands, revealing neatly stacked tin cups and a few plates, arranged not for display but for use, everything in its place without excess. Lena said nothing at first, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in each detail not as something new, but as something familiar in a way that surprised her, because she had known spaces like this before, spaces shaped by necessity, by patience, by the quiet rhythm of survival that does not ask for attention. Ethan entered last, closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate motion that seemed to seal the moment without finality, and he remained near it for a second, giving her time to stand where she was without pressure, without expectation, because he understood that stepping into a place is not the same as belonging to it. Lena moved a few steps forward, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, feeling the worn edge beneath her touch, grounding herself in something solid, something real, and for a brief moment, her shoulders eased again, just slightly, as if the space itself had allowed her to set something down without asking her to explain it. "You keep it simple," she said finally, her voice low, steady, not a question, not quite a statement, just an observation shaped by years of seeing what happens when things become more than they need to be. Ethan gave a small nod, stepping forward just enough to stand within the room, without closing the distance between them. "Simple holds longer," he replied, his tone even, carrying the weight of experience without needing to prove it, and the words settled into the space like something that had already been understood before it was spoken. The boys had moved toward the far side of the room now, where a narrow doorway led to a smaller space beyond, and Noah glanced back, his eyes bright with something close to hope. "We fixed it," he said, pushing the door open wider, revealing a small room with 2 beds placed side by side, blankets folded neatly at the foot, and a third space, empty, but not forgotten, marked by a simple wooden frame that had been recently set against the wall, unfinished but waiting. Lena stepped closer, her gaze drawn to that empty frame, to the quiet intention behind it, and she did not ask who had built it, did not need to, because the answer stood just behind her, patient, steady, offering without pressing. Caleb moved to stand near the frame, his hand resting lightly on the wood. "We thought, maybe," he began, then stopped, not because he lacked words, but because he understood that some things should not be forced into them. And Lena looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just a child, but the quiet courage it takes to make space for someone before they have agreed to fill it. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, feeling the roughness where the wood had been cut and shaped by hands still learning, and something in her chest tightened again, not with resistance, but with the weight of what was being offered without condition. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping into the doorway, not interrupting, because he knew this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the space between what had been and what might become, and the boys waited, not asking, not pressing, just standing in the quiet certainty that some decisions take time to settle into the heart before they can be spoken aloud. Lena let her hand rest there for a moment longer, then withdrew it slowly, turning back toward the main room, her gaze passing over the table, the chairs, the simple order of a life that had been held together not by ease, but by choice. And she moved toward the window, looking out at the land beyond, the fading light casting long shadows across the ground, the horizon stretching wide without boundary. "You built this to last," she said quietly, her voice carrying something deeper now, something that had begun to shift beneath the surface. And Ethan stepped closer then, not into her space, but near enough that his presence could be felt without being imposed. "I built it to hold," he answered, and the difference between the two words settled into the silence like something that did not need further explanation. The wind moved softly outside, brushing against the walls, carrying with it the sound of the land settling into evening. And inside, the quiet remained, but it was no longer empty. It was full, shaped by the presence of something that had not been there before. Lena stood there for a long moment, her gaze still on the horizon, her thoughts moving through places she had not allowed herself to revisit. And then she turned slightly, just enough to look back at the room, at the boys, at the man who had offered her a place without asking her to become anything other than what she already was. She did not speak, not yet, but the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was steady, like the first step of something that does not need to be rushed, only chosen when the time is right. Evening settled over the ranch slowly, like it had nowhere else to be, the last light stretching thin across the land before giving way to something quieter, something that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And inside the house, the air shifted with that same quiet change, the kind that marks the difference between passing through and beginning to stay. Lena remained near the window for a while longer, watching the horizon soften into shadow, her reflection faint against the glass, not fully visible, not fully gone, like someone standing between two versions of herself without choosing which one to keep. Behind her, the boys moved with familiar ease, their steps no longer cautious, no longer measured, but settled, as if her presence had not disrupted their world but completed something that had been waiting. Noah set a small lantern on the table, his hands careful as he struck a match, the flame catching slowly, growing steady, casting a warm circle of light that pushed back the edges of the dim room. And Caleb began arranging a few things on the table, simple pieces, nothing more than what was needed, but done with attention, with a quiet sense of purpose that did not come from being told what to do. Ethan stepped outside briefly, the door opening with a soft creak, letting in a breath of cool air before closing again. And when he returned, there was a slight shift in his posture, the kind that comes from checking the land, from making sure everything remains as it should be. And he set his hat aside near the door, not as a gesture, but as a habit formed over years that did not need to be explained. Lena turned from the window then, her gaze moving toward the table, toward the small circle of light, toward the shape of something she had not stood inside for a long time. And she took a few steps closer, her movement slow, deliberate, as if each step carried a question she was still learning how to answer. "You eat at this hour?" she asked quietly, her voice not breaking the calm, only joining it, and Ethan gave a slight nod, pulling a chair back without looking at her, not offering it directly, just making it available in a way that did not demand acceptance. "When the light fades," he said, simple, grounded, and the boys took their places without waiting, as if this was the rhythm they knew, the pattern they trusted. Lena hesitated for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, the wood warm from the lantern's glow, and then she sat, not fully settled, not yet, but present, and that alone carried more weight than anything spoken. Noah glanced at her with a small smile, not wide, not overwhelming, just enough to show that something inside him had relaxed, and Caleb reached for a tin cup, filling it with water from a nearby pitcher, setting it in front of her without comment, without hesitation, as if the act itself was enough. Lena looked at the cup for a second before touching it, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal, grounding herself in something tangible, something that did not shift or disappear when she needed it to stay. The quiet held as they began to eat, simple food, shared without ceremony, the sound of utensils against tin, the low murmur of the boys speaking to each other in half-sentences, comfortable in their own space, and Lena listened more than she spoke, her awareness still moving between the present and something deeper, something that had not yet fully settled into place. Ethan watched the room in his own way, not directly, not intrusively, but with the kind of attention that notices what others miss, the way Lena held her cup, the way her shoulders had lowered slightly since entering the house, the way the boys no longer looked toward him for reassurance but toward her, and he said nothing about it, because some things lose their meaning when spoken too soon. After a while, the meal ended not with a signal, but with a natural pause, the kind that comes when there is nothing more to add, and Caleb gathered the cups without being asked, moving them to the side, while Noah leaned back, slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward Lena again, as if he had something to say but did not yet know how to shape it. "Will you stay tonight?" he asked finally, the question simple, direct, but carrying a weight that reached beyond the moment, and Lena did not answer right away, her eyes meeting his, then shifting briefly to Ethan, not for permission, but for understanding, and what she found there was not expectation, not pressure, but patience, the kind that leaves space instead of filling it. She looked back at the boy, her expression softening just enough to show that something inside her had already begun to decide, even if the words had not yet caught up, and she nodded once, small, steady, enough. Noah's shoulders relaxed, the tension leaving him in a way that was almost invisible, and Caleb gave a quiet smile, turning back to his task without making it more than it needed to be. The lantern flickered slightly, the flame adjusting to the movement in the room, and outside, the night settled fully over the land, bringing with it a stillness that did not feel empty, but full, like something waiting without urgency. Lena remained seated for a moment longer after the others had moved, her hand still resting on the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood as if memorizing its shape, its presence, and then she stood slowly, her gaze moving once more around the room, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing, and when she turned toward the doorway that led to the smaller room, her steps carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Behind her, Ethan remained where he was, not following, not watching too closely, just allowing the moment to unfold on its own, because out here, the strongest choices are not the ones made loudly, but the ones that settle into place without needing to be forced. And as Lena crossed into that space, the house did not change, but something within it did, something that could not be seen, only felt, like the first breath taken in a place that might finally hold. The night settled deep and steady, wrapping the ranch in a quiet that felt earned rather than empty, and inside the small room, Lena stood, beside the unfinished bed frame, her hand resting lightly against the wood again as if confirming it had not disappeared, as if grounding herself in something that had been offered without demand, and the lantern light from the other room stretched faintly across the floor, stopping just short of where she stood, leaving part of the room in shadow, part in warmth, like a line she had not yet fully crossed. The boys moved in quietly behind her, not rushing, not filling the space with words, but present in a way that carried more weight than any sound. And Noah stepped closer to the empty frame, his fingers brushing along the edge where the wood had been smoothed by careful hands. "We were going to finish it tomorrow," he said softly, not looking at her directly, as if the words might carry too much if they met her eyes too soon. Caleb nodded once, his gaze steady. "We left it like this, just in case." And the sentence did not need anything more, because the meaning sat clearly in the space between them, simple, unforced, waiting to be accepted or left alone. Lena did not answer right away, her eyes tracing the shape of the frame, the uneven lines where it had been built by hands still learning, the quiet effort in every cut and join, and something in her chest shifted again, deeper this time. Not a question, not uncertainty, but something closer to recognition, like seeing a place that had been imagined but never believed to be real. She moved slowly to sit on the edge of one of the finished beds, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight, the sound not sharp, not unwelcome, just honest, and she let her hands rest in her lap, the braided leather still looped loosely around her fingers, its worn surface catching the faint light. "You remember more than you say," she said quietly, her voice directed not at one boy or the other, but into the space they shared, and Noah looked up then, his expression open, without hesitation. "We remember how you stayed," he replied, simple, direct, and the words settled into the room like something that had been carried for a long time without losing its shape. Lena closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in weariness, but in acknowledgement, as if allowing the memory to settle fully into the present. And when she opened them again, there was something different there, something steadier, something that did not look toward the door as often as it had before. From the other room, the faint sound of a chair shifting reached them, a quiet reminder that they were not alone, that this place held more than just this moment, and yet it did not intrude, did not press. It simply existed alongside it. Caleb stepped back slightly, giving her more space without making it obvious, his movements careful, thoughtful, and Noah lingered a second longer before doing the same, both of them understanding without needing to be told that some decisions are made in silence, not conversation. Lena looked toward the doorway then, the soft glow from the lantern outlining its frame, and beyond it, the shadow of a man who had not stepped in, who had not claimed this moment, who had allowed it to belong to her without condition, and she held that image for a second, measuring it not with suspicion, but with something closer to trust, something that had not come easily to her before. The wind moved outside again, brushing against the walls with a low, steady sound, and the house answered it with quiet strength, not shifting, not yielding, just holding, and Lena exhaled slowly, the breath carrying something out of her that had been there for a long time, something she had not realized she was still holding. "You built it for 3, she said after a moment, her voice calm, certain, and Noah gave a small nod, not smiling, not celebrating, just acknowledging what had always been true for him. "We built it for who stayed," he answered, and the words felt older than him, like something learned rather than invented. Lena looked back at the empty frame, then at the boys, and finally toward the doorway again, and the space between those 3 points seemed to settle into something whole, something that did not require her to change who she was, only to decide whether she would remain. She stood then, slowly, the movement unhurried, deliberate, and stepped toward the unfinished bed, her hand reaching out once more, but this time she did not just touch it. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, steady, present, and left it there for a moment longer than before. The boys watched without speaking, their attention quiet, respectful, and when she finally withdrew her hand, she turned toward them, her expression softer, not unguarded, but no longer closed. "Tomorrow," she said, simple, clear, and the single word carried enough meaning to fill the room, because it did not speak of leaving, it spoke of continuing. Noah's shoulders lifted slightly with a breath he had not realized he was holding, and Caleb's gaze shifted briefly toward the doorway, then back to her, both of them understanding what had been given without needing to name it. Lena stepped toward the door then, not hesitating this time, her movement carrying a quiet certainty that had not been there before, and as she crossed back into the main room, the lantern light caught her fully, no longer leaving part of her in shadow, and Ethan looked up just once, meeting her gaze for a brief moment that held more than words could carry, before returning his attention to the quiet task in his hands. Because out here, the strongest things are not spoken aloud, they are simply allowed to be, and in that silence, something settled into place that would not be easily moved. Morning arrived without announcement, just a slow light slipping through the window, brushing against the wooden floor, and climbing quietly up the walls as if the house itself had decided to wake before anyone inside it did. And Lena opened her eyes not with the tension she had carried for so long, but with a stillness that felt unfamiliar, almost uncertain in its calm. For a moment, she did not move, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of the room, the unfinished frame now resting in soft shadow, and she listened, not for danger, not for the sound of departure, but for something simpler, the rhythm of breath in the next room, the quiet creak of wood adjusting to the day, the distant low call of a horse beyond the walls. It was a different kind of waking, one that did not begin with the need to leave. She sat up slowly, the blanket shifting softly around her, and her hand moved instinctively to the braided leather still resting near her side, fingers brushing it, as if confirming that the night had not been imagined, that what had been offered had not vanished with the dark. Outside, the light grew stronger, stretching across the land in long pale lines, and from the main room came the sound of movement, quiet but steady, the kind that spoke of routine rather than urgency. Lena rose, her steps careful at first, not from hesitation, but from awareness, and as she reached the doorway, she paused briefly, her hand resting against the frame just as it had the night before, feeling the same solid surface beneath her palm, unchanged, waiting. When she stepped into the main room, Ethan was already there, standing near the table, a cup in his hand, his posture relaxed but attentive in the way of someone who has learned to notice everything without appearing to look, and the boys sat nearby, their heads bent over something simple, a piece of cloth, a small tool, their voices low and steady, not breaking the quiet of the morning but becoming part of it. Noah looked up first, his face lighting in a way that did not need words, and Caleb followed a second later, his expression more reserved but no less certain, and neither of them spoke right away, as if the presence of her standing there was answer enough to a question they had carried into sleep. Ethan set the cup down slowly, not making a sound, and gave a small nod, not greeting, not asking, just acknowledging that she had crossed from night into morning within these walls, and that alone carried meaning. Lena stepped forward, the floor familiar now beneath her feet, and she moved toward the window again, not out of distance, but habit, looking out over the land that stretched wide and quiet, the early light catching the edges of the fence, the barn, the small details that made up a place someone had chosen to build instead of pass through. "You rise early," she said, her voice softer in the morning, not breaking the calm, only settling into it, and Ethan's answer came just as steady. "The land does not wait," he said, simple, without weight, and the boys exchanged a quick glance, a silent understanding passing between them before Noah stood, walking toward the door and pushing it open, letting in a breath of cool air that carried the scent of earth and grass, and something new beginning. Caleb followed him, stepping out onto the porch, and Lena remained where she was for a second longer, her gaze still on the horizon, measuring something within herself that had not yet been fully named. 8 miles does not feel the same in the morning, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Ethan's eyes moved to her then, not questioning, not pressing, just present, and he answered, "Some distances change when you decide not to run them." The words settled between them without echo, without demand, and Lena let them rest there, not accepting, not rejecting, just allowing them to exist. She turned then, moving toward the door, stepping out onto the porch where the boys stood looking out over the land, their small figures framed by the wide open space beyond, and she joined them without speaking, her presence fitting into the line of sight as if it had always belonged there. The sun had risen just enough to cast long shadows behind them, 3 figures becoming 4, stretching across the ground in a way that made them look connected, not separate, and Noah pointed toward the far edge of the field, where a small section of fence leaned slightly. "We were going to fix that today," he said, his tone hopeful but not asking, and Caleb added quietly, "It is easier with 4 hands." Lena followed their gaze, taking in the distance, the work that waited, the quiet expectation that did not feel like a burden, and for a moment she said nothing, her eyes moving from the fence to the land, to the sky, and finally back to the boys beside her. Then she stepped forward, one pace, then another, moving off the porch and onto the ground, her boots pressing into the earth with a weight that did not carry departure, but presence, and she said, simply, "Then we start there." And the boys moved with her without hesitation, their steps quick, light, while Ethan remained at the porch for a moment longer, watching the line they formed as they walked away from the house, not chasing, not calling, just observing the quiet shift that had taken place without announcement. He picked up his hat then, placing it on his head with the same steady motion as always, and followed, not leading, not behind, but beside, because out here, the distance between people is not measured in miles, but in whether they choose to walk the same direction, and this morning, without saying it aloud, they did. The fence did not look like much from a distance, just a slight break in the long line of wood that marked the edge of the land. But as they drew closer, the details came into focus, the way one post leaned just enough to pull the wire loose, the way the ground beneath it had softened from time and weather, and Lena slowed her steps, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied it, not as a problem, but as something that could be understood if given enough attention. Noah reached it first, placing his hands on the post as if testing its strength, while Caleb crouched near the base, brushing away loose dirt with careful fingers, revealing where the wood met the earth, and neither of them spoke at first, because they had learned that work begins with seeing, not talking. Ethan stopped a few feet away, resting one hand on his belt, watching without stepping in, because he knew that the moment he took control, the lesson would no longer belong to them, and Lena stood beside the boys, her gaze moving between the post, the wire, the ground, reading the quiet story it told. "It did not fall," she said after a moment, her voice calm, certain, and Noah looked up at her, curious. "No," she continued, her hand reaching out to touch the wood lightly. It gave way slowly, and no one stopped to listen when it did. The words carried more than the fence, but she did not explain them, did not need to, and Caleb nodded slightly, as if he understood more than the surface of what had been said. Lena stepped closer then, kneeling beside the post, her hands moving with quiet confidence, pressing against the wood, testing the resistance, feeling where it held and where it shifted, and she brushed more dirt away, exposing the base fully, revealing the space where the earth had loosened its grip. "You fix it by forcing it back," Noah said, repeating something he had heard before, and Lena shook her head gently, not correcting, just guiding. "No," she replied, her tone steady. "You fix it by giving it something stronger to stand in." She reached for a small tool lying nearby, a simple iron spade, and began to dig around the base, not quickly, not with force, but with rhythm, each movement deliberate, each scoop of earth placed aside with care, and the boys watched closely, their attention fixed not on the outcome, but on the way she worked, the way she listened to the resistance of the ground, the way she adjusted without needing to stop. Ethan moved then, stepping closer without breaking the quiet, picking up another tool and working a few feet away, not joining directly, but supporting the rhythm, his presence steady, reinforcing without taking over. The sun climbed higher as they worked, the light warming the land, the air carrying the faint scent of turned earth, and slowly, the hole around the post widened, deepened, until the base could be set straight again, not forced, but guided back into place. Lena pressed her shoulder against the wood, steadying it, and Caleb moved instinctively to hold it from the other side, their movements aligning without instruction, and Noah began to fill the space again, packing the earth back in, firm but careful, pressing it down with his hands, then his feet, until the ground held the post as it should. They stepped back together then, the three of them, looking at the fence now standing straight again, not perfect, not new, but solid, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the result did not need words to be understood. "It will hold," Caleb said quietly, not asking, just stating what he saw, and Lena nodded once, her gaze still on the post. "If you remember to listen before it leans again," she added, and the boys absorbed that in silence, the lesson settling deeper than any instruction they had heard before. Ethan rested his hand briefly on the top of the post, feeling its steadiness, then looked at Lena, not with approval, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been added to this place, something that had not been there before. "There are more along the line," he said after a moment, his tone even, not pressing, just offering the path forward, and Lena glanced down the stretch of fence that disappeared into the distance. The uneven places now easier to see, the work not hidden, but waiting. She wiped her hands against her skirt, the dust settling into the fabric without concern, and she took a step in that direction, not asking, not hesitating, just moving, and the boys followed immediately, their energy light, their steps quicker now, as if the work itself had become something more than a task, something shared. Ethan walked beside them, matching their pace, not leading, not behind, just part of the line they formed as they moved along the fence, for figures against the wide land, their shadows stretching beside them in the growing light. And as they walked, the distance ahead no longer felt like something to endure, but something to shape, one post at a time, one quiet correction after another, until what had been weak stood steady again, not because it had been forced, but because someone had taken the time to understand how it needed to hold. By midday the sun stood high and unblinking, pressing heat into the land until even the wind seemed to move more slowly. And still they walked the fence line, stopping where the wood leaned, where the wire slackened, where small things left unattended had begun to speak louder than anyone had noticed before. Lena moved with a steady rhythm now, no longer measuring each step, no longer holding herself apart from the work, her hands finding their place without hesitation, brushing dust from posts, testing the ground with the edge of her boot, listening in that quiet way that did not rely on sound alone. Noah carried a small coil of wire, his arms wrapped around it with more determination than strength, while Caleb worked beside him, tying, adjusting, learning not from instruction alone, but from watching how Lena paused before each correction, how she let the land show her where it needed to be set right. Ethan kept pace a few steps back, not distant, not removed, but allowing the shape of this work to belong to them, his eyes moving across the horizon now and then, measuring the sky, the distance, the slow passage of time that did not rush but never stopped. They came to a stretch where the fence dipped lower than the rest, not broken, not fallen, just uneven, and Lena slowed, her gaze settling there with a quiet focus that made the boys stop without being told. "This one is different," Caleb said, crouching near the base, his fingers brushing the soil, and Lena nodded slightly, her eyes tracing the line of posts leading up to it. "It is not the ground this time," she said, her voice calm, certain. "It is how they were placed." She walked a few steps along the line, measuring the distance between each post with her eyes, then returned, placing her hand lightly against the wood. "If one is set wrong, the rest will follow it," she added, and Noah looked down the fence, seeing it now, the slight pull, the quiet shift that had traveled farther than anyone had noticed. Ethan stepped closer then, resting his hand on the nearest post, feeling the tension in the wire, not correcting, not interrupting, just confirming what she had already seen, and he gave a small nod, not to lead, but to agree. Lena moved to the center of the dip, her hands firm against the post, and she did not try to force it upright, did not try to fix it in place. Instead, she stepped back, looking again at the line as a whole, and the boys followed her gaze, learning that sometimes the answer is not in what stands before you, but in how it connects to everything around it. "We move this one," she said simply, and Noah blinked, surprised. "Move it?" he asked, his voice uncertain, because it was not what he had expected, not what he had been taught before, and Lena gave a slight nod, her expression steady. "A line must be true from the beginning, or it will never hold at the end." There was no argument, no need for one, because something in the way she spoke carried the weight of understanding, not authority, and Caleb rose without hesitation, reaching for the tool, beginning to loosen the earth around the post, while Noah moved to the wire, easing the tension just enough to allow the shift without breaking the line. Ethan worked beside them now, not taking over, not directing, but adding his strength where it was needed, his movements quiet, precise, and together they lifted, adjusted, set the post back into the ground a few inches from where it had stood before, not far, but enough to bring the line back into alignment. The work took time, not because it was difficult, but because it required attention, and when they stepped back again, the difference was subtle, almost invisible to someone passing by, But to them, it was clear, the line now running straight, steady, holding its shape without string. Now it will carry the rest, Lena said, her voice low, not as a statement of pride, but as a simple truth, and Noah nodded slowly, seeing it now in a way he had not before, while Caleb pressed his hand briefly against the post, feeling the balance, the quiet strength of something set right. The sun had begun to tilt westward by then, the lights softening just enough to take the edge off the heat, and the land stretched wide around them, unchanged and yet not the same, because something within it had been tended, corrected, understood. Ethan looked along the fence line, his gaze moving farther than before, and then back to Lena, and for a moment there was something in his expression that had not been there at the station, not doubt, not caution, but a quiet recognition that what had been offered had taken root in ways he had not needed to ask for. "You see what most miss," he said simply, not as praise, not as surprise, just as an acknowledgement, and Lena did not answer right away, her gaze still on the line they had corrected, her thoughts moving through something deeper than the work itself. "It is not about seeing," she said after a moment, her voice soft but certain. "It is about staying long enough to understand." The words settled into the space between them, carrying more than the fence, more than the land, and the boys listened without speaking, because they knew now that some lessons are not given, they are lived. A breeze moved across the field then, lifting the grass in slow waves, brushing against the posts they had set, and the fence held, steady, quiet, not needing to prove its strength. And for a moment they all stood there, not moving, not speaking, just watching how something simple, when done with care, could change the shape of everything it touched. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, the kind that settles deep into the bones of a place, where the work slows not because it is finished, but because it has found its rhythm, and along the fence line, the four of them moved without needing to speak, each step carrying a shared understanding that had not been there the day before. The sun dipped lower, casting a softer light across the posts they had straightened, the wire now holding its line with a quiet confidence, and Lena paused once more, her hand resting lightly on the last post they had set, not to check it, but to feel the steadiness beneath her palm, the way it answered without resistance. Noah wiped his hands against his shirt, dust settling into the fabric without concern, and he looked down the length of the fence, his eyes tracing the path they had walked, the places they had stopped, the small changes that had added up to something larger than he had expected. "It looks different," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Caleb nodded beside him, his gaze steady. "It feels different," he added, and Lena glanced at them both, her expression quiet, not smiling, but softer than before. "That is because you did not just fix it," she said, her voice calm, carrying the weight of something learned long ago. "You understood it." The words settled between them, not heavy, not light, just true, and Ethan stood a few steps back, watching the three of them, his posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of stillness that comes from seeing something unfold exactly as it should without needing to shape it. He walked forward then, stopping beside Lena, his gaze following hers along the fence line, out toward the edge of the land where the posts disappeared into distance. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some acknowledgments do not need words to be felt. The breeze shifted, cooler now, carrying the scent of evening, beginning to rise, and the sky above softened into colors that did not rush but faded slowly, like something letting go without resistance. "There is more work tomorrow," Ethan said finally, his voice even, not pressing, just stating what the land would always ask, and Lena nodded once, her hand falling from the post as she turned back toward the house, the path behind them now marked not just by footsteps, but by what they had done together. The boys moved ahead, their energy lighter, their steps quicker, as if something inside them had settled into place, something that no longer needed to search for where it belonged, and Lena followed, her pace steady, no longer measured by distance, but by presence. As they reached the house, the shadows had grown long, stretching across the porch like quiet lines drawn by the setting sun, and Lena paused at the base of the steps, her gaze lifting to the doorway, to the simple frame that had marked a boundary the night before, and she stood there for a moment, not hesitating, but recognizing what it meant to cross it again, this time not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had begun to stay. Noah stepped onto the porch and turned back, waiting without calling, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken, and Caleb stood beside him, his posture calm, his presence steady, and Ethan remained just behind Lena, not close enough to guide, not far enough to be absent, simply there, as he had been from the beginning. Lena stepped forward then, her boot meeting the first wooden plank with a soft, familiar sound, and she climbed the steps without pause, her hand brushing lightly against the railing as she passed, not to steady herself, but to feel the shape of something that had begun to belong to her in a way she had not expected. Inside, the house held the same quiet as before, but it no longer felt unfamiliar, no longer felt like something she had to measure herself against, and she moved through it with a natural ease, setting her small cloth bag down near the table without thinking, the gesture simple, but carrying more meaning than anything she could have said. Ethan noticed it, not with surprise, not with reaction, just with a quiet awareness that settled into his expression for a brief moment before it passed. And he turned toward the window, looking out over the land as the last light faded, the fence line barely visible now in the dimming glow. The boys moved to their places without hesitation, their voices low, their movements familiar, and Lena stood in the center of the room for a moment, her gaze moving slowly across the space, taking it in not as something new, but as something that had begun to hold her presence without question. She reached for one of the chairs and pulled it out slightly, the wood scraping softly against the floor, and she did not sit immediately, her hand resting on the back, her fingers tracing the worn edge once more, as if confirming what had already been decided without needing to be spoken. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying through the room without effort, and Noah looked up, a small smile touching his face, while Caleb nodded once, understanding the word for what it was, not a delay, not a condition, but a continuation. Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her gaze across the room, and in that look, there was no question, no expectation, only a quiet recognition of something that had found its place without being forced. Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, brushing against the fence they had set, the posts holding firm in the cooling air, and inside, the silence settled again, not empty, not uncertain, but full, carrying the weight of something that had begun without needing to be named, something that would not announce itself, but would remain, steady as the land, quiet as the work that had brought it into being. The night deepened again, but it did not feel the same as the one before, because something had shifted quietly, something that no longer needed to be questioned or held at a distance. And inside the house, the lantern burned lower, its flames steady, casting long shadows that no longer felt uncertain, only present, like the passing of time itself. Lena stood near the window once more, but this time she did not look beyond the land as if measuring how far she might need to go. She looked across it as something that had begun to answer back, something that did not push her away or demand that she prove her place within it. The fence line they had worked stretched faintly in the distance, barely visible in the dark, yet she could feel it, the quiet line they had corrected together, the steady hold of something that had once leaned and now stood firm, and her hand rested lightly against the window frame, not as an anchor, but as a simple acknowledgement of where she stood. Behind her, the boys had settled into their beds, their breathing even, untroubled, the kind of sleep that comes when something long unsettled has finally found ground to rest on, and Ethan remained near the table, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer that of a man watching over uncertainty, but of someone who had stepped back enough to let what needed to take root do so without interference. The silence between them was not empty. It held something complete, something that did not need to be filled with words, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, because there was nothing left to decide in the way there had been before. Lena turned slowly, her gaze moving from the window to the room, to the small details that had begun to shape themselves around her presence, the chair she had pulled out earlier, the place where her bag now rested without being held, the unfinished bed in the other room that no longer felt like a question, but like something waiting to be completed. She walked toward the table, her steps steady, unhurried, and when she reached it, she did not pause, did not hesitate. She simply reached out and set the braided leather down beside the lantern, the the small object catching the light for a moment before settling into stillness, no longer carried, no longer held as something separate from where she stood. Ethan watched that movement, not with surprise, not with reaction, but with a quiet understanding that settled into his expression, and he gave a slight nod, not to her, not to the moment, but to the truth of what had just been placed there without needing to be named. "You do not have to. Stay," he said after a moment, his voice low, even, not offering escape, not testing her resolve, simply stating what had always been true, and Lena looked at him then, her eyes steady, clear in a way they had not been before, and she answered without hesitation, "I know." There was no weight in the words, no tension, only certainty, and that alone carried more meaning than any promise could have held. She moved then, not back toward the window, not toward the door, but toward the smaller room, her hand brushing lightly against the frame as she passed, and this time she did not stop there. She stepped inside, her movement natural, unforced, as if the space had always been hers to enter. The unfinished bed stood where it had been, waiting without urgency, and she reached for one of the tools left nearby, a simple piece of wood and iron, lifting it with a familiarity that came not from ownership, but from understanding, and she began to work, not quickly, not as if something needed to be completed, but with the same steady rhythm she had carried through the fence, each movement quiet, deliberate, shaping what had been left open into something that could hold. The sound of wood against wood filled the room softly, not breaking the silence, but becoming part of it, and from the doorway, Ethan watched without stepping in, without offering help, because he understood that this was not something he could build for her. It was something she had chosen to finish herself. The boys stirred slightly in their sleep, the faint sound of movement reaching them even in rest, and Noah shifted closer to the edge of his bed, his hand resting lightly against the frame, as if sensing what was happening without needing to wake, while Caleb remained still, his breathing steady, the quiet confidence of someone who no longer questioned whether morning would bring the same presence it had before. Lena continued until the last piece settled into place, the frame now complete, not perfect, not polished, but solid, and she stepped back, her hands resting at her sides, her gaze taking in what had been finished, not with pride, not with relief, but with a quiet acceptance of what it meant to have stayed long enough to see something through. She turned then, stepping back into the main room, her eyes meeting Ethan's for a brief moment, and nothing needed to be said, because the work had spoken for itself, the same way the fence had, the same way the land did when someone listened long enough. Outside, the wind moved gently across the field, brushing against the posts that now held their line, and inside, the house settled into the kind of stillness that does not come from emptiness, but from something being exactly where it belongs. Lena walked to the table once more, her hand resting briefly near the braided leather before moving away, and she took her place without being asked, without being told, simply because there was no longer a reason not to. And out here, where the land does not ask who you were before you arrived, only whether you choose to remain, that was enough. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.